folks at the first service get so enthusiastic they don't stop. Good morning, and welcome to the Plymouth Sunday Forum. We're going to wait just a minute while another group comes in. Good morning, and welcome to Plymouth Sunday Forum. We're very glad you're here, whether in person here in the chapel or online. Plymouth Church has had a close relationship with Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative, dating back to the days of the Plymouth Church Foundation, some 20 years ago. Beacon's vision has been that everybody has a home, a stable, safe place from which each inhabitant can thrive. Achieving that dream has often felt like trying to move mountains. But the collaborative of over 100 congregations has accomplished some miraculous things. We're deeply honored this morning to have with us the new CEO of Beacon, who will talk about the mountain that is the affordable housing challenge and share how he envisions the way ahead. LaTondresse has most recently served as a Hennepin County Commissioner. As chair of the Housing and Redevelopment Authority for the county, his role was instrumental in securing an unprecedented level of support for housing stability. He worked diligently to foster relationships with mission-driven developers and inspired and nurtured housing advocacy. Earlier, he served in the Obama administration in the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives at USAID and was a senior leader in the Expectations Project, a national civil rights advocacy group. Chris, a very warm welcome to Plymouth.
Well, good morning, everyone. I just want to thank Plymouth Congregational or Plymouth Church and the Housing Justice Committee Board of Outreach for welcoming me here today. And wow, just looking around the room, I'm really inspired and honored to be here. I'm here in my capacity today as the new president and CEO of Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative. As most of you know, I'm also most recently a former and recovering elected official. Jackie, as you said, I served as county commissioner and HRA chair. And I'll say I didn't have this particular transition on my 2023 bingo card. Perhaps the happiest with this transition is my wife. I'd be up for re-election this next year, and she doesn't have to go through another re-election campaign. But I just wanted to start today by expressing my gratitude for Plymouth Congregational Church and the incredible leadership here, and the role of that leadership in Beacon's story, and actually in my own story. I'll share a little bit of my own story in connection to Plymouth over the years. First for Plymouth, it won't be a news headline to many of you in this room that that Beacon exists because you do. The Plymouth Neighborhood Foundation was the origin story and the genesis of Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative. Just by show of hands, how many of you in this room are completely new to Beacon, that Beacon's not an organization that you're too familiar with? You see, just a couple, and I won't call you out. For the rest of you, how many of you have been intimately or really involved in some aspect of Beacon's mission, whether it's an advocate, somebody who's helped provide leadership for one of our projects, or perhaps you've contributed financially? Just show of hands and raise them high. I mean, wow. When I say Beacon exists because you do, it is not a hyperbole. It literally is true. I myself am learning a little bit more of that origin story as I think about not just Beacon's past, but Beacon's future. When we think about what it takes to meet our moment of crisis on housing instability at the intersection of affordability and homelessness, it's really about way more than bricks and mortar. It's about cultivating the political will necessary to make this kind of housing possible in the first place. We'll talk a little bit about that today. It's not just about marshaling the considerable public and private resources needed to make these projects happen, both on the capital side and the service side. It's about cultivating the political will necessary to make those resources possible, but as Beacon learned in its origin in Genesis, just steps from here with Lydia, literally being picketed at times, it takes considerable political will to cultivate the moral imagination in our leaders needed to say yes to some of these projects, even where we have the resources marshaled. I also want to share a little of my personal connection to Plymouth Congregational Church. It was just under 2 decades ago, as a recent graduate of Bethel University, that I started my professional journey as a young Minnesotan in Washington, D.C., at a Christian social justice organization called Sojourners. I served as a time as a special assistant to Jim Wallace. This was during the God's Politics era, for those of you familiar with that work. And at the same time, Plymouth, under the leadership of Jim Gertmanian, hosted this national retreat for emerging young progressive leaders that I got to be a part of. And I'll say that retreat came at a really important inflection time, or an inflection point for me in my faith and leadership journey, especially as the son of conservative evangelical missionary parents. I'll say more about that background in a moment. But it came at a time when I was personally asking a lot of questions, evolving from one kind of vision of what faith means in the world and in our lives into a version of faith that isn't afraid of the big questions and takes seriously our responsibilities to one another, especially to the most vulnerable. It's also at that retreat that I met Beacon for the first time. Part of that retreat was we had a session here in the morning, and then we walked across the street to a newly opened Lydia. And I remember, for me as a young advocate, the role that played in awakening my sense, my moral imagination for what's possible from our advocacy and political will building. It's not just about changing policies. It can literally create spaces where people can live and thrive and grow and make our whole community stronger. So I think the bottom line here is that Plymouth is an incredibly special place, both for Beacon as an organization and for me personally. And so that's really where I want to get us started today. Today's presentation is called Moving Mountains Together, and that's where I want to start. Really grounding us in our mission, our collective mission. And when I say that, I don't mean specifically Beacon's mission, though Beacon plays a really important role in that. I mean our collective mission and responsibility to care for one another, with a very specific and particular focus today on housing and our housing crisis, because of the fundamental importance of housing to that vision of a society where we can all live and thrive. As with so many of you in this room right now, and hopefully for even more of us moving forward, Beacon just gets to hold a little piece of that mission. So I want to start by just sharing a little bit of my own story, pulling together a few different threads, not just because I want to talk about myself, but really as an invitation into reflecting on our own stories and how that informs our why and our connection to this work. You're looking at a 10-year-old Chris LaTondresse there with my 8-year-old sister sitting on a bridge over the Neva River in Moscow in 1993. I grew up in Hopkins, as I said, the son of conservative evangelical parents. My dad was an architect, my mom was an English teacher. part of their spiritual journeys had always been a desire to be missionaries. So when I was 10, my sister was 8, they quit their job, sold our house, and we moved overseas to post-Soviet Russia. We found ourselves landing in Moscow in October of 1993 in the middle of a constitutional crisis that boiled over into an armed conflict on the streets of Moscow for the future of that nation. And what you're looking at there is the Russian Houses of Parliament after a 3-day skirmish between Yeltsin's forces and the parliamentary forces. Whoa, there's an echo in the room. I was like, is that you? Is that you, God? We're listening. We're listening. We're listening. All right, we're good. All right, good. And this formed in me a pretty significant set of experiences, both in Russia and on the other side of that experience when we moved back to the United States 4 years later, that really became a foundational and formational experience for informing how I look at this work. You know, number one is just faith as a real profound source of inspiration and resilience. And though I would not be so bold as to move my family internationally for the same parents or same reason my parents did, it did instill in me this idea of the power of faith and the idea that there are things in life worth making profound and enormous sacrifices for, and that's really what changes things. Second is the role of institutions, power, and politics in shaping our lives. You know, the consequence of this action in Russia was really in revealing the fundamental fragility of these institutions and what that's meant even for our present day situation in geopolitics and with Russia in the world. A real sense at an early age, I wouldn't have necessarily had the words to go around it at the time, but for the role of institutions, how they hold us, how we hold them, and the fundamental fragility of it all if we both lose our confidence and faith in these institutions and our sense of responsibility to hold them together. Finally, it created for my family and for me, as we moved back to the United States, my dad had to restart his architecture practice. My mom, who was a public school teacher, got a part-time job back in the district, but really not enough to make ends meet. And there was some pretty lean times in there where my family had our own lived experience of housing instability over about a half a year period, where we relied on the generosity and in many cases, couches and basement apartments of friends, family members, congregants of some of the supporting congregations that made it possible for my family to have some stability. And I remember what it meant when my parents were able to pull together just enough resources to get our own apartment, get reestablished in Hopkins in the community that we had left, and what that meant in terms of our not just sense of well-being, but my parents' ability to put their lives back together on the other side of what was a profoundly meaningful experience internationally, but also very destabilizing for our family. And so when I think about this housing instability work, it's personal for these reasons. And I know that my family just went through a fraction of what many of the individuals and families that experience long-term chronic housing instability and homelessness experience in Minnesota. So just to pull these three threads together, faith, power, politics, institutions, and just this issue, this urgent issue of housing, I wanted just to share a little more about my own story and then how that connects to this moment. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I started my professional journey at Sojourners, a national faith and justice advocacy organization, and that's where I first discovered what I call as a calling to devote my professional life to the intersection of faith and social justice. And really inspired by the power of activated communities of faith, this calling propelled me into leadership roles at the United States Agency for International Development in the Obama administration, the Expectations Project, where I helped stand up more than a dozen state and federal advocacy campaigns, grew networks of advocates, developed powerful cross-sector partnerships. I've also learned through that work, I guess the main message there is my professional life in connection to politics, systems, power has primarily been outside of government. I've had a couple of experiences inside of government, but it's primarily been about movement building. In that work, I've learned that it's often not enough to change policies or expand investments alone if we want to move mountains of injustice. We need to build power. We need to change hearts and minds. It's this thought that when politics fails to solve or even address the biggest issues of our time, social movements often rise up to fix and change politics. And throughout our nation's history, the best of those movements have often had spiritual foundations or even been led by communities of faith. You think about the abolition of slavery, child labor law reform, women's suffrage, and of course the civil rights movement. I have personally witnessed, as I know many of you have in this room, the power of that change firsthand, and we have collectively helped foster that. We get to be a part of that story. You can draw a straight line from the work that happened in the civil rights movement. I mean, the third major piece of civil rights legislation was the Fair Housing Act. You can draw a straight line between that work and the work that we get to do today. So we're here because we fundamentally believe a small number of mobilized communities and individuals can affect big change. Put differently, if we have faith the size of a mustard seed, we can move mountains. Beacon is in that mountain moving business. I believe you're here today because you all are in that mountain moving business. And it matters because I think that we can all agree we have some big mountains to move. Housing instability is a mountain. Changing hearts and minds, whether it's in the Minneapolis or the Minnesota legislature or the Minneapolis City Council or the St. Paul City Council, or for the purposes of one of our recent projects, the Shakopee City Council, Scott County. That's mountain moving work. And so that's where I want to ground us today, is around this bigger problem we're trying to solve for. It's certainly a technical problem in search of a technical solution, and we know what the solutions are, but I hope we can all agree it's more than a technical problem. But I'm going to start with some facts, some data, and some grounding in some of the technical solutions around this. As many of you know, our region currently faces an intersecting crisis of homelessness and affordable housing. In many ways, as I said, this challenge is a technical problem requiring a technical solution. One that right sizes our public and private dollars to scale our housing supply, particularly on deep affordability, to meet this really urgent moment of need. But on a deeper and more fundamental level, this is a human problem that requires a human response. And that also means that it's a moral problem, requiring an awakening of our hearts, our spirits, and not just our minds. And so if we can accomplish nothing else today in the short time that we have together, I hope our conversation helps awaken and fan that flame in you. That you're not just an actor sitting outside of this story, but as someone who can help change it. Your specific role can help change this story. That's why we're here. So that's the problem we're trying to solve for. How might the Twin Cities, our region, close deeply affordable housing gaps at massive scale to meet the fierce urgency of our housing crisis? Just to ground us in some of the data, 45% of Twin Cities families are housing cost burdened, meaning they pay more than a third of their income on their rent or their mortgage. And that's both rental households and homeowners. And the further you move down the income spectrum, in other words, the lower income you get, the wider these gaps are. It's actually 8 in 10 extremely low-income families are housing cost burdened. And there's also a racial disparity frame that you can put on this. Half of black households in Minnesota are housing cost burdened compared to 25% of white households. So if you double click into this number, there's also a really profound racial justice and racial disparity story that we have to elevate in this discourse. And with the sunset of the federal eviction moratorium, so over the course of the pandemic, the federal government put in place rules around the non-eviction of tenants and matched those rules with unprecedented federal investments in the form of emergency rental assistance to pay owner-operators, landlords. Still wasn't enough to meet that gap, but at least helped stabilize residents and provide some financial stability for landlords. With the sunset of the federal eviction moratorium and the expiration of those dollars, which was really a cliff, what we saw in Hennepin County while I was there as that happened was we moved to a 4-month backlog in housing court, so in eviction court. What we saw through the pandemic with these rent stabilization dollars was actually, if you think about homeless shelter, not affordable housing, but shelter, across our system, just on family homelessness in particular, we try to keep in Hennepin County our shelter system at about 80% occupancy. We want to have some slack in there because in Hennepin County we have a shelter all policy for families. If you're a parent with a child and you call, we have to find a place for you to sleep at night. We don't have that same responsibility or policy around adults, but for families we do. So we needed to keep some slack in the system. So it usually operates at about 80% occupancy. Through the pandemic, it actually moved down to its lowest watermark in history, 25% occupancy. In other words, through the massive scaling of public resources, we were able to stabilize families in their homes. It's not a surprise. When you provide individuals and families with the resources they need to remain stably housed, they stay stably housed. When those protections went away, what we saw was an absolute surge. As we sit here today, when I left Hennepin County 4 months ago, we had seen a surge to about 300% of shelter capacity. So Hennepin County, we actually, how many folks are Hennepin County residents here? Most of you. 1 full levy point in 2024 is devoted to emergency family support. It's about $9 million. As Hennepin County has contracts with hotels in Bloomington to house families. So we sit here today, it's actually surged to almost 400%. It's a hair on fire emergency on family homelessness in particular, but we know that extends to individual homelessness as well. As we even in the news this week, our hearts go out to, we sort of tear our hair out around the eviction of residents at encampments. It's family homelessness, it's individual homelessness, it's across the board. So we've seen this surge, and we don't have to look far to understand why. It's a more fundamental issue. What you're looking at here is the gap of affordable homes for our lowest income residents in our region. There are roughly 112,000 households at 30% of the area median income in our 7-county metro area. And we currently have 40,000 units that would be affordable to a family at that level. That's a startling 70,000 unit gap that directly corresponds to this crisis that we're experiencing. It's not a surprise we're in a crisis. And this right here, this chart, probably more than any other I could show you, is really the housing instability crisis in a nutshell. And so as we sit here this morning, we really have 2 futures in front of us. It's one future where we continue down the current course and our current crisis of housing instability gets worse, because I can tell you it's not going to get better on its own. Of individuals and families right on the edge, 1 paycheck away from falling into homelessness, from losing the house that they currently have. and the invisible and visible signs of homelessness growing in our community. I think about both individuals and families. Family homelessness is often the more invisible piece of that. I say that as a former school board member before I was on the Hennepin County board. Suburban family homelessness, urban family homelessness is our invisible homelessness crisis. It's not just encampments. And along with this, the substantial human, societal, economic, community safety, quality of life, and moral impacts of that. And another future where enough of us say enough is enough, where we cultivate that moral imagination in ourselves and in our friends and neighbors to say that we believe in home. We believe in homes for all, and that we're willing to do what it takes to scale the public and private resources to create more housing, stably house residents, strengthen the sector in organizations and developers and service organizations that hold this work so we can better serve residents, and to cultivate the political will for all of this to continue to be possible. That's really the choice in front of us today. Two futures. One that we will walk into whether we choose it or not if we do nothing, and the other that can be cultivated and chosen if we're willing to act. And as we all know, the costs of inaction are extraordinary. So what's our opportunity? Well, first, I want to talk about solutions, both moral and technical, but I'll start technical. Our opportunity is that together we can mobilize to close deeply affordable housing gaps at massive scale to meet the fierce urgency of our housing crisis. And I think, first of all, it's important to say that we know what works. So you're looking here at what is called an affordable housing continuum. This particular version of it is Hennepin County's housing continuum. But when we as policymakers think about targeting our investments in various housing strategies, this is sort of the picture that we look at. We operate significant or marshal significant resources in the direction of emergency shelter. That is not permanent housing, but it is a place, at least on a crisis basis, for some residents to find some measure of housing stability. But then as we move up the scale, we talk about a wide range of options, from deeply affordable and supportive to just affordable housing broadly, maybe at 50 to 80% of area median income, moving up to workforce and market rate housing, and then of course homeownership for those that see that as a solution and can afford it. But what I really want to talk about today, specifically around that gap, if you think back to that slide I shared of the gap on deep affordability, the real solution to addressing this is this orange tier here on deeply affordable and supportive housing. It's really a missing tier of housing in our region. If you roll back the clock 20 years ago, it was almost non-existent. In fact, and this is going back to the Beacon origin story and the Plymouth role in that story. In the creation of Lydia, Plymouth played a fundamental role not only in creating homes for those particular residents with services, that continues to this day and is in fact grown. You helped create and awaken an imagination for what's possible, a whole new sector of deeply affordable and supportive housing that we have seen policymakers at a local and state level respond to in how they think about scoring housing awards, in terms of how they think about supporting those housing projects with additional services. So it's not just about the bricks and mortar. What Lydia made possible is not just homes for those residents. What Lydia helped make possible is a conversation about deeply affordable and supportive housing that continues to have ripple effects across our state and local governments. But we've only written the first couple of chapters on that story. I think that's what I want to impress upon folks today. I'll also say here that in my role as Hennepin County HRA chair, I oversaw Hennepin's investments in this space. And Hennepin is now in year 3 of a 10-year vision for deeply affordable and supportive housing. It's a 10-year, $100 million strategy that is designed to create, any guesses how many units those investments will create? A very much needed 1,000 units, additional units of housing. 10-year, $100 million strategy. I'll say that there's not even a similar strategy yet, however modestly sized at the state level. It really represents the only significant public strategy and investment on deep affordability. Ramsey's starting to catch up with this too, on deep affordability that we see across our governments. And it's going to create 1,000 units of housing compared to that 70,000 unit gap. That should give us both a sobering sense of both what's possible when we step up and marshal our resources. Those 1,000 units are going to make a big difference. That's about how many shelter beds we operate in Hennepin County as well. But we also need to significantly scale our approach. So a little bit more about deeply affordable and supportive housing. This is a definition from the National Corporation for Supportive Housing. What supportive housing is essentially housing that matches deep affordability and permanent stability, right? This is not transitional housing, this is not shelter, this is permanent homes for individuals and families, affordable at 30% of the area median income, and matching those housing opportunities with services appropriately targeted to that population. So when you think about Beacon's work, we have a portfolio of about 19 properties, about half of them we'd consider deeply affordable and supportive. You know, as we select projects now, we think about not just the geography, but the particular population it's going to serve. So that ranges from Bema-Seda in downtown Minneapolis, which was a specific response to the Wall of Forgotten Natives. And that's for facilitating direct exits from homelessness, high fidelity harm reduction for individuals with real deep end services. It's extraordinarily costly, but extraordinarily needed as we look at what's happening in our news today. You move out to Hopkins, where I live. If you drive just past Main Street, you'll see a building going up, Vista 44. It's 50 units of deeply affordable and supportive family housing with a service provider that's designed to help families. We just got an approval in Richfield for Astor Commons, which is going to be roughly 40 units, Kevin? 38 units targeting neurodiverse youth, so youth in some place on the autism spectrum or associated adjacent dynamics with a service provider to match it. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about deeply affordable and supportive housing, a technical solution in the direction of a technical and human challenge. I think more broadly, though, in order to solve for this crisis, as I said before, this is more than a technical problem requiring technical solutions. What you're looking at here is a framework I actually developed as HRA chair to think about as a policymaker how we might better partner at Hennepin with Hennepin County, other local governments, the state government, the federal government, in telling the story of what's needed in order to actually scale. Because, as I said, Hennepin County's vision, important but not right-sized to the needs of the moment. And what became clear to me is that in order to move mountains of housing instability, in order to scale to meet our moment on housing instability, it really comes down to three simple but profoundly challenging things. Is number one, we need to significantly scale the public and private investments available for this kind of housing, both to build it and also the services represent year in and year out costs in order to serve these residents. This housing, and really affordability at any level in our system, only happens through significant and deep public subsidy, just full stop. Whether we're talking about Section 8 housing opportunity vouchers or capital investments at a state and local level in our projects, federal tax credits, public subsidy is what closes the gap on affordability, whether that gap is 20% all the way down to 70% in order to make our deep affordability projects happen. And Beacon doesn't take on a single project even on deep affordability, and Beacon's just one example of this. It costs, even with those public subsidies, nearly $20,000 a unit in private contributions to make these projects pencil. So it's both the public, the private resources then leverage considerably more public resource, but we need to scale public resource significantly. Number two, we need to strengthen our sector of mission-driven developers to ensure that we can hold and sustain this work. And I'll say, many of you have seen probably in the news stories, you probably saw the stories about Beacon with Lenoke and some of the security challenges there, just naming them transparently. You've probably seen recently there was an article in the Star Tribune about similar challenges with Common Bond, senior property, Project for Pride and Living. Right now, the sector is in significant, and I don't say this word lightly, distress. The increased vulnerability of our residents, the aftershocks of the pandemic. The pandemic is not over for the residents that we serve, and I don't mean the virus, I mean the social and economic impacts. The opioid crisis, our broader community safety crisis, has put extraordinary pressures and costs on owner-operators to operate with fidelity, excellence, and care the housing that we operate right now, let alone think about scaling. And so there needs to be significant reimagining at a public system level, and also in helping friends, donors, supporters understand the increased costs that will be associated in sustaining this kind of housing over the long term on the service side. And that's something that you all can help Beacon and others play a role in telling that story. And whenever you see a story that sort of makes it look like one of us owner-operators maybe is falling down on the job, I'd say we're all doing the best that we can out here, but our costs have gone up, our revenues have gone down, and our residents are more vulnerable than ever before. So we need folks' help more than ever before. Finally, it's about political will building. As I said earlier, both in order to marshal the resources for existing projects and future projects, but also as Plymouth learned through that picketing, you need to cultivate significant power in order to marshal the resources and win individual project approvals. I mean, that was one thing that really came through loud and clear in my role as an HRA chair, and I started having conversations with the leaders of some of these nonprofit developers. I said, what's your biggest barrier in bringing new projects online? They said, well, it's a hero's journey every single time you're trying to marshal the resources just to get these projects to pencil and to put shovels in the ground and to cut a ribbon at the end. But actually, as significant a barrier is oftentimes the approvals at a local level needed to make these projects happen. And you can do all of the work of marshaling the capital and resources, and you have a great project together, and it can literally die on a 4-3 council vote. It happens all the time. And that's why the political will building piece is so important. That's work that no single individual, developer, single organization, Beacon, others, our peer organizations can do alone. That's literally work that is only possible because of the people sitting in this room and rooms like this that we need to help create all over our Minneapolis, St. Paul, our region, and our state in order to walk into a vision that allows us to move mountains of housing instability. And so just to touch down just very briefly in Beacon's work and Beacon's role in all of this, which I know most of you are familiar with, but I won't spend much time here. Beacon is an organization that believes in home. We are an organization that is not just in the bricks and mortar business. We're not just in the business of serving existing residents with fidelity and care and excellence. We're in the business of cultivating that political will necessary for Beacon and every other operator in our space to actually make this kind of housing possible. From our origin story with Plymouth 20 years ago to where we sit today, Beacon has grown a network of nearly 100 congregations across the metro area with advocates who, whether it's in their own backyard at their city council meetings or in St. Paul, is building the collective political will in order to address this challenge, and meet the moment of our crisis. And that's what we want to invite you all to continue to participate in. I think on your way out the door, we have our annual congregational convening coming up. Really would encourage all of you in this room to attend that if you want to learn a little bit more about the role you might play in this work moving forward as we step into, in particular, the next legislative session. I hope that you'll join us for that. What day is it?
January 18th at 6:30 at Richfield United Methodist Church.
All right, there it is, and it's also on the document there. So where I'll end us today is just with a story, and then I'll leave some time for questions here, and then let those of you that are going to the 11 o'clock get out of here. You're looking at here a photo of my then 4-year-old son. He just turned 5, standing in front of one of Beacon's new projects in my hometown of Hopkins. This is Vista 44 I shared earlier, 50 units of family supportive housing. And this summer, he was between his summer programming and the beginning of school. I hadn't started at Beacon yet, so I had a day to figure out what the heck I was going to do with a 4-year-old, which is always an adventure as a parent. And we just decided to go for a walk to downtown Hopkins. And we went to our favorite little Greasy Spoon Hoagies, for any of you that have been there. We stopped into Bud's music store, looked at ukuleles. He actually got one for Christmas, so good on him for twisting my arm on that. Then we walked to the other end of Main Street. There's a little toy store called Kitty Wampus. We took a look in there. And I was like, holy smokes, we're actually like 1 block away from this new Beacon project that's literally a hole in the ground turning into a proper building. What an exciting opportunity to take him down there and show him what Dad's new job is going to be. So we walked down there, and I was primarily myself looking at the construction workers and the hard hats and the heavy equipment. That's exciting for anyone, especially a 4-year-old. And I said, Hugo, this is Daddy's new job. We're building buildings like this for families and kids. That's moms and dads and little kids like you that don't have a place to live right now. 50 families are going to be able to live here. And so as we walked away from there, he was a little bit more quiet than he usually is, and I thought it was probably because he was contemplating backhoes and construction equipment. But he said to me, Dad, I have a question. We got about a block away from there. He said, Dad, I have a question. I said, what is it, buddy? And he said, where are they living now? 4 years old. Where are they living now? I share that story because I think about the role of these projects, any of these projects that we're so bold to embark on making possible. When I say we, I mean us together. I don't just mean Beacon. And what these projects mean, not just in terms of the bricks and mortar and the families that are going to be housed in these places, but in the role of projects like this in cultivating the moral imagination of a 4-year-old, and really the role of these projects in cultivating our collective moral imagination for what's possible. That is the future that is clear as day to a 4-year-old, and it should be as clear as day to all of us. And it's a future that we can choose if we decide to walk into it together. And as true as I stand here today, what happens next is up to us. So it's up to us. So thank you. Around the microphone. We've got a little time for some questions here.
Yeah, and if you would speak into the microphone when you ask your question so that the people at home can hear the question.
And we'll do a hard stop maybe in 10 minutes to give folks time to transition, but I'll also stick around and I'm available to chat with anybody who wants to. So.
Don't know if this is accurate history or not, but there was a time when the federal government greatly decreased the amount of support it gave to housing. I don't know if it was in the 1990s or the early aughts, but it was there, and people were saying things like, I believe it's called the Robert Taylor housing housing project in Chicago and the Glenwood project in Minneapolis. They weren't working because they combined too many people who were quote-unquote undesirable, and so they decreased the amount of money going to government-supported housing, and they said, let the private sector do it. Well, now we're seeing that the private sector doesn't give enough money to it. My question is, would supportive housing greatly help some of the problems that we saw at Robert Taylor or in the Glenwood projects, because they didn't exist then? What portion of the need would that have fulfilled?
Yeah, it's a great question that perhaps there's other experts in the room that could speak even better than I am, but at risk of oversimplifying, yes, there was a time sort of product of LBJ's war on poverty, HUD, significant federal investments in public housing, right? Government funded and run housing that gave us a lot of the large housing projects that we see today, some of which we've literally bulldozed and torn down because, as you say, it concentrated just too many people with extreme vulnerability and need in one geographic location and one physical location without the appropriate level of service. And so there was a significant shift, I think, both for that reason, but also just politically, the Reagan era and onward, in significant outsourcing and privatization of our approach to many issues. You think about the dismantling the mental health system and the moving away from federal investments in that to sort of state block grants. What we've seen is the creation of federal tax programs like LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, that have essentially said, well, if you can figure out how to use tax credits to pull together these deals, the private sector, so for-profit, nonprofit developers can figure out how to make these deals happen. We'll give you a tool for it, but we're not gonna invest in the way that we once did. And I'd say part of that is a consequence of politics. The other is just the reality of what we've learned, lessons learned around how to do this well. To your point, supportive housing I really see as not the total solution, but one really fundamental, important part of the solution, where again, we're not building 100-unit, 200-unit buildings and then leaving people to fend for themselves. We're right-sizing these properties, targeting particular populations, matching them with an appropriate level of service for that population where possible, and it's why I'm excited about all of our projects and the unique needs they meet. But particularly, you think about some of these family projects in the suburbs, Cranberry Ridge, Vista 44, what we're trying to do with Prairie Point down in Shakopee, Gladstone Crossing in the East Metro. These are all projects that are gonna give extremely low-income families an opportunity to have affordable, stable housing, near transit, near jobs, in good school systems that are really gonna transform lives and really do. And that's why this type of housing is so important.
Is that relevant to an example of one of those 4-3 votes that you mentioned has scuttled a project in a city council or in some kind of council? Or if not, what is a typical reason that there is such a 4-3 negative vote?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to a word I think most are familiar with, or many, which is NIMBY. It stands for not in my backyard. It's this idea that neighbors often feel some kind of way, and I'll say the reasons for that are wide and varied, ranging from reasons that I don't think many of us would align with or agree with, to reasons that might even just be more benign. It's like, well, hey, listen, like, is this the right place for this? I don't want this right here, right? Like, there's a whole range of reasons folks might not want a project like this happening in their backyard. But the bottom line is, whatever the reason, it usually marshals a significant groundswell of community opposition. And what I've seen, just an example right in Hopkins with Vista 44, a tale of two projects. Vista 44 happened because, yes, predictably, there was a groundswell of community opposition to that, but Beacon was able to fill those council chambers and planning commission meetings with folks who said, we are here to stand with our new future friends and neighbors. We need this and welcome this in our community. That's what ultimately prevailed. Literally 2 months later, there was a project with an organization, I'm trying to remember, Art Space, I think is the organization. They wanted to do a very similar project in housing. This was workforce housing for artists, a much less complicated, politically, practically, you name it, project. That failed on a 3-2 vote because there had been such neighborhood opposition organized, fomented around Vista 44, that when 2 months later, the next affordable project came up to the council dais, there was a well-organized group of neighbors who said, hell no, we don't want this here. And you know what? There wasn't anybody there to say we want this here. So we see it all the time, is the bottom line.
I just want to insert a comment that we had all the picketing with Lydia House, but when we wanted to increase the size of Lydia House, the neighborhood said fine. So it does work.
That's right.
Another question? You just pass it.
Your son's comment about where are they living now hit home with me because I have a son and daughter that are also very compassionate, but it made me also think about the recent visuals that we've seen of the entire Minneapolis police force kicking people out of embankments and things like, or their encampments. And I'm curious, one of the things I keep seeing that's making people probably feel better about themselves is, well, they're not moving to these homeless shelters, or there's all this availability for them. Why aren't they going there? And I just wondered if you could speak to that. I know there's lots of reasons why people don't go to shelters, and there's very complex situations. But in a case like us kicking everybody out of an encampment, where do people go?
I mean, that is the question. And if the answer were that as a society we provided enough resource, stability, infrastructure, housing for people to go, we wouldn't have encampments to begin with, full stop. I believe that. I think it actually starts with not at a local and community level. Our nation has not made a choice. Our nation made a choice with this third piece of civil rights legislation to say, well, we're not going to discriminate on housing on the basis of race. In principle, and I think in practice, we see all sorts of, we have a whole body of legal work around this now. We have not as a nation yet decided that we believe that everyone should be housed. If we did, our main federal tool for this, which is Section 8 vouchers, housing opportunity vouchers, wouldn't be funded at 25% of the need. For every 4 eligible families in America, there is 1 voucher available. Whether that's a voucher that follows an individual or that's a voucher that gets baked into a project, a lot of the work that Beacon does is through project-based vouchers where we attach these vouchers to units, and that what makes the whole thing work. 4 to 1 underfunded. It's one of the only examples of a significant federal anti-poverty intervention that's not universal. Food stamps, Medicaid. These are programs that if you are income eligible, you receive them. They are universal programs. Housing's not one of these programs. That would require significant public investment. And in the meantime, it's sort of then fallen to state and local governments to try to deal with the fallout of that. And one example of where Beacon and others have stepped into that gap is with our Bring It Home Minnesota campaign. At the legislature this last year, we went and we said, we need, and some of you may have played a role in some of that advocacy, we said we need to create a new voucher program in the state of Minnesota. If Washington won't act, Minnesota needs to act, and we need to create a program for that. That was what led to the creation of the local option sales tax on housing, the creation of both a state voucher program and a Twin Cities voucher program that's creating a considerable number of new vouchers, but it's still not enough for the gap. But I think that's really what it comes down to is yes, there's a political and technical and financial piece of this, and I don't want to understate that, but it's really a political and moral decision that we as a society have not decided that we're going to house people.
I'm sorry, but we're going to...
Can I ask one quick question?
Why don't you follow up with me afterwards to make sure we can let folks go. Listen, I'm so grateful and so honored that all of you would give me a little of your time, give Beacon a little of your time this morning, and in all of the other ways that you've held and supported this collective mission with your time, talent, treasure, hearts, and minds in the past and will continue in the future. Just thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I want to take just a minute for any of you who don't know Kate Tabor, she is our liaison with Beacon from Plymouth, and so very important. And I'll bet you have a comment about the convening.
Yes, I just wanted to say I'm the person to talk to if you want to follow up and learn more about this work and the need and how you can be involved. And the next big thing that we need to get folks out to is the convening on the 18th, and I'd love to see you there. It's going to be a wonderful time. We're going to hear again from Chris. We're going to hear from a service provider and a resident from our building about the state of housing and the crisis right now. We're going to hear from some state legislators. We're going to talk about the power of congregational organizing, and then we're going to head into some trainings to get equipped for the work ahead this year. So come join us.
Thank you, Kate. And please come here again next Sunday when Sarah Wolf, the Strategic Policy Director at Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, will talk to us about how climate and environmental justice are inextricably intertwined. And it promises to be another very important day. So thank you so much, and we know that Beacon is in good hands. Thank you, Chris.